We've all heard the arguments once the baby boomers die off, the guitar market is going to crash, nobody's going to want vintage guitars anymore, nobody's going to care about guitar anymore. But what what happens when you examine the data? What happens when you examine history? What does that really tell you? That's what we're going to get into. So, hi everyone, welcome back to the Ministry of Guitar. I'm Utkarsh, coming to you from Singapore. As always, if you enjoy this channel, please do like, subscribe, and share. Provides very, very important encouragement. So I wanted to make this video using some data. This is not going to be a comprehensive analysis and it's not going to bore you, but I do think it's important to have some numbers rather than just opinions. So that's going to be the endeavor of this video. Let's get into the term baby boomer itself. What does that mean? It's a very, very influential generation. Technically, it's defined as a generation born between 1946, post the war, hence the baby boom, everybody coming back from the war and making babies, I guess, till about 1964. And this generation saw a lot, right? They saw the emergence of rock and roll, Elvis, the Beatles, all the way into all the rock and prog of the 70s. Enough has been said. So how big is this very, very influential baby boomer generation? How big are they? And for the purpose of this, I'm going to concentrate on the US, which is where baby boomer comes from. But I'm also going to bring in Western, or rather, I'm just going to bring in Europe as a whole. Though Western Europe is, of course, more correlated to the US, but I could not find the Western Europe data specifically. So the size of this population is today it's about 65 million. It used to be about 76 million, but of course 10 million people of this generation have passed on. The size of this population in Europe is about almost double. It's about 140, 130 million. Again, I could not find the exact number of how many have ever lived and died, but this gives you a good indication. So give or take, we have about 200 million baby boomers, which is Western Europe and which is Europe and US. Now, of course, you have people born of this age in other countries, India, South America. It's a continent. Africa is also a continent. I'm just giving examples. I mentioned India as a country. But point is, of course, you have people from the rest of the world. Thing is, the electric guitar was not such a big thing it was that you will find people popping up from Brazil or say from South Africa or from Australia saying, of course, it mattered to all of us. But big picture, it was really concentrated. It was a cultural phenomenon from this part of the world. So you have 200 million people, these baby boomers who are driving the guitar market, driving Gibson to do all sorts of things. Now, there are two parts to the argument that I'm going to present to you. One is going to be the size and the interest of guitars for millennials vis-a-vis baby boomers. We'll talk about that. And the second part of it will be other populations and the geopolitical / economic development of the world and the interest in guitar. There are two arguments here. We'll talk about both of them. Let's examine the millennial generation. How big is the millennial generation? Here, luckily, because marketers are obsessed with millennials, I was actually able to get a chart. So in the US and in Europe, the size of millennials is very similar to the size of baby boomers. So you have about 76 million millennials. You have about 76 million millennials in the US. You have about 148 in Europe. Very similar in size to baby boomers. This is a very interesting thing that Gen X was actually smaller than the baby boomers and then millennials went up. Now, I can see the counter arguments flying my way. Millennials don't care as much about guitar as baby boomers. Guitar was a big part of popular culture for baby boomers, not so much so for millennials. I think that argument is correct, but one does need to accord for two different factors. One factor is that playing guitar was much more male-centric in the baby boomer generation. It is less so in the millennial generation. So that is automatically doubling the population who could potentially be interested in playing / buying a guitar. One interesting finding, which is from Fender, that I want to bring up here is that what people find is that a lot of people want to play guitar. a lot of people try to pick up guitar. Only 1 in 10 people who pick up guitar, play guitar, end up playing guitar. But once you end up playing guitar, you end up buying a shitload of them. Case in point. So the point here is, for the millennial generation, because you have the entire cohort, the entire 76 million in the US and the entire 148 million in Europe, both men and women potentially interested, much more so than the baby boomer generation, where it's mostly men. So if you look at the baby boomer generation, which was 70 million in the US and 140 in Europe, that's only half who are as interested. So that's one thing. So even if the average person, or rather the average man, is less interested in guitar, as the average millennial man is less interested in guitar than the average baby boomer man, there is a lot of millennial women who are much, much more interested in guitar than the baby boomer women. So that's one factor. I don't have any way to quantify this, but it's a lot of this is pretty obvious to see in terms of cultural trends. Taylor Swift effect is of course one thing, but you can see this. You can see this in the makeup of students who go into guitar shops, to learn guitar, etc. So that's one factor. The second thing, going back to the Fender data point that I mentioned to you, that it's all about getting somebody to play the guitar. Then you are the guitar for the guitar companies and the guitar industry. It is gold, because now they're going to buy a lot of guitars and a lot of equipment and strings and pedals and goodness knows what all. What has become much easier for the millennials than the baby boomers? What did the baby boomers have to learn guitar by? You have all of these now iconic stories of perhaps it's Brian May or perhaps it's Jimmy Page there, or maybe it's Eddie Van Halen. They're slowing down the tape so that they can figure out what's being played. In fact, I think even John Petrucci had a very interesting story. I don't remember where I heard it, where you have to slow down the tape to figure out the notes, etc. Very complicated. Even for me, I'm a millennial, but I started playing guitar in 2004. I literally didn't have all the tools that you have today. So I had to rely on a little bit of hearing, a little bit of some tab that I downloaded from somewhere, a little bit of a friend that I could find who could teach me a little bit. It was not easy. Today, compared to baby boomers, or compared to even for me, older millennial, because millennials are all the way from, say, the early 80s till the early 90s, it's so much easier now. You have all of these different tools which make it much, much easier to learn and pick up guitar. And guitar, the main thing with the guitar, it's an instrument that's very difficult to pick up. It's not like a piano, you just press a chord and you immediately get a nice sound. For a guitar, to make a nice sound, you need to be able to properly fret the thing. So that factor is there. Now, will the combination of both men and women being interested in guitar and the fact that guitar is easier to learn, will that compensate for the cultural impact that the guitar had in baby boomers generation? I don't know. It could go either way. There is no scientific way to make this argument, but it is there to consider for those people who say that, hey, only the baby boomers were interested, guitar is going to die out with the millennials. Now, I want to get to the bigger factor here, and bigger purely in terms of numbers. The difference between the baby boomer generation and the millennial generation in terms of the global scope of guitar is very different. Because what has happened is, in the post-war years, a big chunk of the world's population, which is Asia, Africa, was essentially recovering from colonization, from being a colony. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a history lesson, but the reality is that both of these parts of the world were relatively extremely impoverished. You just look at GDP per capita, you will be shocked. Now, of course, with the world being globalized, so on and so forth, that is changing. On top of that, you have, of course, the internet. You have things like YouTube. So what has happened is millennials in, say, Africa, say in India, say in China, say in Indonesia, say in Malaysia, anywhere which was previously a developing country, suddenly, they are having much more money relative to their baby boomer generation ancestors, much, much more. The GDP per capita is catching up. I think I relayed this on a different video. I was shocked to see, like, especially in India, or say in Bangalore, which is where my family stays. I was shocked to see how expensive houses and even salaries and how much they've gotten compared to what they used to be. There was a time when I live in Singapore, one of the most expensive places. To go from Singapore to India would be a major salary cut. It's not really that much the case, especially in the professional corporate world. Similarly, going from the US to India, say you go from the US to Bombay, Mumbai, or Bangalore, it's no longer a big salary cut, the kind that you would think. So that gap has extremely narrowed, which means that these millennials, relatively speaking, have means. Secondly, they have interest because guitar is such a global culture. Of course, there were Indians and there were Chinese and there were Indonesians who had interest in the guitar, and even in my parents' generation, the baby boomers generation. Sure, they were there, but there were very, very few. There were very, very few. Guitar culture was not a global culture, not the way it is right now. Now, so that tells you that you have these folks, these millennials of this age, from the developing parts of the world that are more interested than their baby boomer ancestors and have the actual money to buy guitars and to buy good guitars, some of them. Now, here's the killer piece of data. How big do you think this cohort is? So we talked about the number of millennials in the US and in Europe, 76 million plus 148 million. So say 220 to 30 million. This cohort in Asia is 1.1 billion. 1.1 billion of millennials. 5 times or 4 times what you have in the Europe and US. This is not to say that all of these folks are going to be interested in guitar, but they are just going to be a lot more relatively interested versus its predecessors. So even if the average Asian, so to speak, is 1/4 as interested in guitar as the average American and is 1/4 as able to buy, that still doubles the number of people potentially buying guitars versus the baby boomers times. And I'm just talking Asia. You have a lot of people in Africa, 278 million, South America, 155 million. Can you see how big this is? And this is, for me, a lot of the major blind spot because I think a lot of us are not really aware of population numbers and how they work. So it's crazy. This looking at these numbers is one of the reasons why I am, relatively bullish long-term on the guitar market. And I've talked at different points in time about how I think of guitars as an alternate asset, as a potential inflation hedge. But I want to talk now a little bit of culture. To say that a certain culture, a certain iconic piece of culture will die out when the proponents of this culture die out is a very, very inaccurate thing to say if you look at how history has played out. So think of the great Italian masters from the Renaissance. Think of the great painters, the early modern art painters. Think of everybody, if you think Italian masters, think of Leonardo da Vinci. If you think of painters, think of someone like Vincent van Gogh from 100 plus years ago. Think of Pablo Picasso. The generation that initially adulated these folks, that generation is long gone. Has that made the myth of the Italian masters, the myth of these painters go down? The myth continues to grow. The values on their paintings continue to grow. Reality is that sometimes death is the best thing that happens to a legend because it becomes more legendary. So rock and roll, the entire movement of the 60s and 70s and early 50s, mid 50s, late 50s, my apologies, that was a kind of thing that the world had never seen before. It has become a part of popular culture, a part of lore. Today, if in a corporate setting you want to say someone's doing well, they say, oh, that guy's a rock star. You know what I mean? That's how iconic it is. Just because all the rock stars die out doesn't mean it stops being this iconic. In fact, it becomes more of a myth. Earlier, at least, you have people who could have lived in the time and they said that, oh no, it wasn't really as great as you thought. But now, once everybody's dead and gone, it's even more of a myth. It's even more iconic. What do you think is going to happen? And guitars are like that, right? They're instruments, of course, but they're also, in a way, memorabilia and in a way, pieces of art. So, rock and roll today, what you think of the Renaissance, tomorrow, that is probably what rock and roll will be. Maybe when I'm in my 80s and 90s, that's how people who are young then, who are maybe born in the 2060s, 100 years after they emerged, rock and roll will be like, wow, what was that? And maybe the burst, which today may be $200,000, probably worth millions and millions. I think that's for sure, pretty much. So anyways, this is my point of view. Love to hear what you think about it. And as always, keep watching. Let me know what you think about the content, and I will see you next time.